approximately 9:35 p.m. Suddenly, and without warning, the U.S. consulate at Bengasi was attacked. As many as 125 armed men descended on the consulate from all directions. In total, the attacks lasted 7 hours, striking in 2 waves. In the end, many were wounded, while 4 U.S. personnel ended up dead, including United States Ambassador Christopher Stevens. Who attacked us? And who was behind the operation that stole Ambassador Stevens' life? The allies of President Barack Obama.
The elephant in the room is that Obama is the new Osama. The same people who carried out September 11, 2001, carried out September 11, 2012. They are the same people that the US and the British backed in overthrowing Kadafi, and they are the same people that the US and the British, the Saudis, Qatar, are employing to bring about the Blair doctrine of limited sovereignty through the overthrow of Assad, the attempted overthrow of Assad in Syria. And these forces are Al-Qaeda.
In 1990, in eastern Libya, a militia group was founded calling themselves the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. They were picked up by British intelligence MI6, who assisted the group in their attempt to overthrow Gaddafi. In 1996, they failed, and by 1998 were effectively defeated, sending hundreds of the Libyan fighters fleeing to Afghanistan, Sudan, and Iraq, while many were imprisoned by Gaddafi in Tripoli's notorious Abu Salim prison. Among those who managed to escape and avoid imprisonment were Abdel Hakim Belhaj and Sufyan bin Kumu. These men and the hundreds of members of the Islamic Fighting Group became President Obama's allies in the 2011 successful overthrow of Gaddafi. Sufyan bin Kumu and Abdel Hakim Belhaj will be joined in the 2011 jihad against the Libyan government by Wissam bin Hamid, a key commander of a Libyan militia. They are Al-Qaeda, and their profiles speak for themselves. Sufyan bin Kumu. Sufyan bin Kumu escaped a 10-year sentence in 1993, fleeing to Egypt. He then traveled to Afghanistan and trained at the Torkham camp of Osama bin Laden, where he became a faithful adherent and followed Osama bin Laden to Sudan. He joined Libyan Islamic Group in 1998. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, he was arrested in Pakistan and sent to Guantanamo Bay prison when it was revealed that he had been Osama bin Laden's personal driver. While detained, the Department of Defense Joint Task Force Guantanamo drafted an assessment identifying that Kumu's name was found in the laptop of a financier of the September 11, 2001 attacks, Mustafa al-Hawzawi. The assessment specifies: detainee's alias is found on a list of probable Al-Qaeda personnel receiving monthly stipends. His alias was also found on Al-Qaeda's 11 September attacks financier Mustafa al-Hawsawi's laptop as an Al-Qaeda member receiving family support. Detainee's probable name was found in the pocket litter of Arab mujahideen who entered Croatia from Bosnia in 1996. One of the mujahideen who had his pocket litter confiscated was Isa Mukrin, leader of the Al-Qaeda Mukrin cell in Saudi Arabia, responsible for the beheading of U.S. citizen Paul Johnson. Sufyan bin Kumu transferred from Guantanamo to Libya, where he was released from Abu Salim prison in 2010 and became the leader of the Ansar al-Sharia militant group formed during the effort to kill Gaddafi. Kumu's al-Sharia gained recognition after the Battle of Sirte and became prominent after Gaddafi's extrajudicial murder. Wissam bin Hamid. Wissam bin Hamid is a commander of the militia group Libyan Shield and Free Libya. According to Arabic sources, Hamid commanded Libya Shield rebel forces that besieged Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, resulting in the capture and extrajudicial murder of Gaddafi. The jihadist forum Al-Fetan has archived a biography of Hamid, identifying him as a veteran of jihad in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, fighting against U.S. forces. Under his command, Libya's Shield fought under the flag of Al-Qaeda. A Library of Congress research report published August 2012 cited Wissam as the head of Al-Qaeda in Libya, while hosting a Northern African Al-Qaeda chief as his guest of honor during a parade. Abdelhakem Belhaj. Abdelhakem Belhaj gave an interview for Doha Al Jazeera satellite channel television in Arabic, where he was identified as having left Libya in 1988 for Saudi Arabia, then headed for Afghanistan to jihad against the Soviets until the fall of the Kabul regime in 1992. Belhaj then headed for Sudan and stayed until 1996, which means, for the span of about 7 years, Belhaj was with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan and then Sudan, where bin Laden lived until he was expelled in 1996. After the Libyan War, Belhaj was appointed head of the 20,000-strong Tripoli Military Council. His appointment was made possible after the assassination of its former commander, Abdel Fattah Yunus, who defected from Gaddafi. As documented in the Library of Congress report, the Tripoli National Council never fully controlled the rebel movement. Its military wing, first headed by Abdel Fattah Yunus, Gaddafi's former army chief of staff, lacked a functional chain of command for the desperate and fragmented rebellion. Yunus would eventually be assassinated in July 2011, most likely by one of the Islamist rebel factions close to Al-Qaeda. Indeed, a fatwa circulated during the same period on the jihadist websites recommending the assassination of former Gaddafi aides. The assassination was never fully investigated, and Belhaj was quickly given Yunus's former position as commander of the Tripoli Military Council. It was during this council that Belhaj and his political ally Ali Salabi would force Mahmoud Jibril to resign as the Tripoli National Council's chief executive. The Library of Congress report concludes that these two Islamist leaders were expected to play a major role in the new Libya.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya. But the United States, together with the international community, is committed to the Libyan people. You have won your revolution, and now we will be a partner as you forge a future that provides dignity, freedom, and opportunity.
After Kumu and Belhaj were released from Abu Salim prison, and Hamid gained a decade of experience fighting against U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, the three were brought together under the auspices of the Executive of the United States, armed, and called the Liberators of Libya. These three and others were provided air support by the U.S. President without the consent of Congress to wage jihad in Libya, and eventually became instrumental in the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, September 11, 2012.
This current relationship between President Obama and these Al-Qaeda networks is not just some recent flirtation. This is a long-standing and deep relationship, and you've really got to go back to the opening days of President Obama's first term in office to get a full flavor for what we're dealing with here. During his 2008 initial campaign for president, he made a firm promise to the families of the 9/11 victims that he would declassify the 28 pages from the original congressional 9/11 investigation that documented the high-level funding from the Saudi kingdom and leading figures within the Saudi royal family of the 9/11 hijackers. Instead of keeping his promise, President Obama met with the families of the 9/11 victims in February of 2009. They met in the Oval Office. Obama reiterated his promise to release this critical material, and he not only reneged on the promise, but he became complicit with the Bush-Cheney administration in perpetuating and, in fact, intensifying the cover-up.
Five and a half hours after the initial attack, 8 U.S. Marines from Embassy Tripoli arrived at Benghazi airport to provide assistance to the remaining Americans hiding out at a CIA safe house. According to an involved party, only identified as Febrayer, there was an argument at the airport between Libyan Shield and the U.S. Marines lasting 15 minutes over who should lead the convoy of Americans and Libyan militiamen, supposedly to a medical center outside the besieged consulate. Eventually, it was agreed that the U.S. officers would lead and the Libyan militia were to follow at a distance so as not to cause suspicion. The Marines suddenly changed direction. Febrayer was ordered to continue following them. Arriving shortly after the Marines at the CIA compound around 4 a.m., Libyan Shield quickly scattered from the location. Only minutes later, the second wave of armed attacks began. Hours before the first attack, U.S. Embassy Tripoli reported to the State Department in a regular weekly report that officials had met with the leader of Libyan Shield, Wissam bin Hamid. Hamid warned officials that if the U.S.-backed candidate for Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril were to win, Hamid would cease to provide security for Americans in Benghazi. The report was signed by Ambassador Christopher Stevens. The relevant section reads, militia commanders discussed the Muslim Brotherhood, Jibril, their political aspirations, the economy, and security. In a September 9 meeting, local area militia commanders Wissam bin Hamid and Mohammed al-Gharabi discussed the very fluid relationships and blurry lines they say define membership in the Benghazi-based brigades. They claim to exercise control over Libyan Armed Forces Chief of Staff Youssef Mangoush, who depends on them to secure eastern Libya. In times of crisis, Mangoush has no other choice than to turn to their brigades for help, they said, as he did recently with unrest in Kufra. Al-Gharabi and bin Hamid support the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood's Justice and Construction Party-backed candidate Awad al-Barasi for prime minister. They criticize United States government for supporting National Forces Alliance leader and prime minister candidate Mahmoud Jibril. If Jibril won, they said, they would not continue to guarantee security in Benghazi, a critical function they asserted they were currently providing.
So what you have is a threat directly from Libya's shield, whose head fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, who was identified in the Library of Congress report as potentially the head of Al-Qaeda in Libya. And we're meeting with this person 2 days beforehand, and he gives this threat. And then it's his forces that meet our Marines at the airport, escort them to the CIA annex, and shortly after they arrive, the firing begins. So you have an attack by Ansar al-Sharia, which is Al-Qaeda. You have the attack from them, and you have Marines arriving and being escorted by another Al-Qaeda affiliate to the annex, and the firing begins immediately after they arrive. Obviously, they now know where the annex was. The Marines only had GPS coordinates. They didn't even have an address. So they had to follow them to the annex. So there's your Al-Qaeda. These are the same people we supported to overthrow Gaddafi.
One of the earliest official reports by the CIA identified Qummu's Ansar al-Sharia as one of the main attackers of the 9/11 Benghazi assault. On the night of the attack, witnesses reported pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns and bearing the logo of Ansar al-Sharia, which were used as roadblocks to make escape from the consulate difficult. According to Representative Peter King, former CIA Director David Petraeus confirmed the involvement of Ansar al-Sharia to members of Congress during a closed-door briefing. The identification of the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Ansar al-Sharia was extremely excluded and replaced with information asserted by the Obama administration's U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, during her appearance on 5 different talk shows Sunday, September 16th.
We have no information to suggest that it was a pre-planned attack. This is a fairly volatile situation, and it is in response not to United States policy, not to, obviously, the administration, not to the American people. It is in response to a video, a film, that we have judged to be reprehensible and disgusting.
Go back to Belhaj. Belhaj, after the overthrow of Gaddafi, was named the military commander of the Tripoli Military Council and was put in charge of security for all of the foreign embassies in Libya, including the U.S. Embassy, and in charge of security more generally throughout the country.
Current commander of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, once spoke highly of Belhaj, assuring him and Qummu, while they were in Abu Salim prison, that their cause would be continued by Al-Qaeda. Dear brothers, the Amir of the Mujahideen, the patient and steadfast Belhaj, and the rest of the captives of the fighting Islamic group in Libya, here is good news for you. Your brothers are continuing your march after you, escalating their confrontation with the enemies of Islam, Gaddafi and his masters, the Crusaders of Washington. Belhaj now was in charge and apparently met with no opposition by the Obama government to protect U.S. embassies in Libya. In November, weeks after Gaddafi's execution, the Libyan Zatan Brigade detained a man at Tripoli airport, headed for Istanbul, reportedly using a fake passport. Zatan's leader, Tahir al-Turki, confirmed the story, identifying that the man detained using false ID was Abdel Hakim Belhaj. A military official working under Belhaj admitted the purpose of his trip was to meet with rebel leaders of Syria in Istanbul and on Turkey's border, calling it an important mission where Belhaj, according to sources, discussed sending Libyan fighters to train anti-Assad troops.
As the Libya events were unfolding, you already had the beginnings of a drive to overthrow the Assad government in Syria using the same combination of resources. In fact, Kadafi, before he was overthrown and assassinated, had developed very extensive stockpiles of all kinds of weapons, including shoulder-held anti-aircraft missiles, including anti-tank weapons, you name it. And after the overthrow of Gaddafi, a lot of those weapons simply went onto the black market, and a lot of them fell into the hands of Al-Qaeda in Libya. In fact, it was some of those weapons, like RPGs, that were used by the Al-Qaeda front group Ansar al-Sharia to carry out the assault on the U.S. mission and the CIA station in Bengasi, which resulted in the killing of Ambassador Stevens and 3 CIA officers. A lot of those weapons, we know, have now since then gone into Turkey and have been smuggled across the border into Syria to arm, guess what? Another branch of Al-Qaeda that has been doing all of the heavy combat operations to overthrow the Assad government.
Called the elite troops on the ground by the Free Syrian Army, the Al-Qaeda fighters from Iraq changed their names, but not their identities, in late 2011, forming al-Nusra. Like Wissam bin Hamid, al-Nusra gained nearly a decade of experience at war with the United States Army under the Al-Qaeda flag in Iraq. So when the conflict in Syria began, they were better trained than the ordinary Syrian opposition fighter to storm Assad's fortified positions, striking military bases and airports, and capturing production facilities such as Syria's oil fields. The group's affiliation with Al-Qaeda has also been identified by Iraq's Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari, who told the Associated Press in early July 2012 that Iraq had solid evidence that members of the extremist group Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who previously had streamed from Syria into Iraq, were moving in the opposite direction. Zebari said, "Our main concern, to be honest with you, is about the spillover, about extremist, terrorist groups taking root in neighboring countries."
The State Department and Treasury Department today have finally placed the al-Nusra group on the list of international terrorist organizations. Now, is this going to make any difference on the ground inside Syria in terms of what's going on? Absolutely not. The al-Nusra group is the dominant fighting force. Because they're successful, they get more of the money from Saudi Arabia, they get more of the weapons, and what the State Department was forced to acknowledge today is something that we've been saying here at LPAC TV for weeks and months, namely that the Syrian opposition is dominated by Al-Qaeda.
Al-Nusra claimed the responsibility for the bombings in Aleppo, Medan, and the Damascus bombing of March 2012. Al-Nusra has been behind the killing of civilians, the murder of the journalist Mohammed al-Sayed, the attack on a television station on June 27th, as well as the advanced sabotage of radars and rockets and multiple attempts to occupy official Syrian military bases. The Al-Qaeda outgrowth led the largest base attack on the Taftanas military airport on November 2nd, a strategic base of Assad's army containing up to 48 helicopters. By May of 2012, it was known that the United States was both facilitating the movement of weapons to Syrian opposition groups through CIA involvement and turning a blind eye to the role of regional U.S. allies Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey in arming Syrian rebel groups, where they were receiving multiple shipments of arms including AK-47s, BKC machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-tank weaponry across the Turkish border by a network of intermediaries, including Syria's Muslim Brotherhood. A month later, in June, the New York Times leaked a report from multiple sources, including top American officials and Arab intelligence officers, stating that a small number of CIA agents were operating in southern Turkey to help allies decide which Syrian opposition fighters would receive arms to fight the Syrian government. At that time, the Obama administration stated that it was not providing arms to Syrian rebels, but nodded to the fact that Syria's neighbors would do so. The watershed moment of the U.S. involvement in Syria came on December 11th when Barack Obama announced, "We've made a decision that the Syrian opposition coalition is now inclusive enough, is reflective and representative enough of the Syrian population that we consider them the legitimate representative of the Syrian people in opposition to the Assad regime, and so we will provide them recognition."
لا يميزون أي شيء أمامهم. دوكمنتال الناس حولنا وقفوا تحت القصر. الناس حولنا وقفوا. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. جماعة الناس الله أكبر. الله أكبر عليك يا بشار. الله أكبر. نيران تحت القاعدة.
It is currently unclear whether this will mean even more direct U.S. involvement in the Syria conflict. There has been some speculation that it is the prelude to the U.S. moving in heavy weaponry, establishing a no-fly zone, and is essentially an open declaration of war against the Assad government. It is clear, however, that this is a blatant violation of the June 30th Geneva Communique agreed to by the U.S., Russia, China, and other major world powers and regional powers. But what's a treaty obligation to Obama? Although Obama stated on December 11th that the recognition of the Syrian opposition specifically excludes the al-Nusra group, the very opposition the Obama-led United States is supporting depends entirely on al-Nusra. That opposition has made clear their disagreement with the terrorist blacklisting. It is known regionally and internationally that without al-Nusra, there is no so-called Syrian military overthrow of Assad. Thus, in effect, Obama unblushingly gave his support to Al-Qaeda again. He officially recognized as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people the Al-Qaeda that aided in the murder of over 3,000 American soldiers in combat in Iraq, the Al-Qaeda supported and protected by Saudi Arabia, Great Britain, and the United States again and again in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in the September 2001 attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C.
Now, I think it's also very important to remember that President Obama spent the better part of this year campaigning for re-election and only touting one foreign policy success. And that so-called success was that he killed Osama bin Laden and claimed that he had crushed Al-Qaeda as the result of that. Well, he clearly was ultimately responsible for the killing of Osama bin Laden, but it's looking more and more like a leadership succession within Al-Qaeda.
The executive of the United States was sworn into office in allegiance to the purpose of the Constitution of the country, to act in the nation's defense and provide security. Yet, the networks who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and the imperial body within Britain and the Saudi royal family that finances these groups, harbors them, and allows the execution of certain of them when no longer useful to their cause. The executive has protected and covered up for. It is a fact that President Obama never held to his promise he made personally to families of 9/11 victims in the Oval Office on February 2009 to release classified documents that would reveal how Prince Bandar bin Sultan and the Saudis financed the 9/11 hijackers. It is a fact that the president in 2 separate occasions used members of his administration to sabotage court cases against the financiers of the Al-Qaeda attackers.
So in effect, President Obama has aligned himself strategically with Al-Qaeda. They were the main force that the US backed in Libya to get rid of Kadafi. They are the main force in Syria on the ground, doing the heavy lifting, fighting. And once again, we're laying the basis for turning the keys to Damascus over to Al-Qaeda. So that, to my mind, represents a pretty damning case for the impeachment of President Obama.